Again, my name is Todd Sevig, and I'm a Director of Counseling and Psychological Services here on campus, one of the co-chairs. And just want to say good morning and welcome to today. And trust that you had a good night last night after a full afternoon, and hopefully got to experience a little bit of Ann Arbor, those of you who are from out of town. You know, the weather this time of year, at least in this part of the country, for those of you coming from other places, the warm weather tends to go hand in hand with the rain and the clouds. So at least we have a little bit of warmth, which is nice for those of us from here. But it is cloudy, which just means that our smiles and our hearts will have to provide the sunshine for today. So this conference has always tried, as we said yesterday, to really use for the greater good our multiple roles on this thing we call a campus community. And another thing that we've tried to do is a near optimal mix of theory, data, conceptual work, and then also practices. And so that is the theme for the next hour and a half with our opening panel for this morning. It is, as you've seen in the program, a follow-up from Dr. Cornish's opening keynote yesterday. And the theme for the panel is how can we take this theory and conceptual and data from a whole bunch of different sources and put it into practice. It will be focused on what a counseling center can do, but I encourage all of us to think, okay, in my role, how can I use some of these practices? If you're not in a counseling center. And so that integration of theory to practice, back to theory, the evolution of some of these new ways of providing support, services, and care to our students on all of our campuses is what we're going to go for this morning. So it's my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Cornish, and to also introduce the other two folks that you see on the panel. Dr. Jillian Berry is the Associate Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at George Washington University. Dr. Berry obtained her master's and doctoral degrees from Birmingham University in England and is licensed in the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia. She's worked full-time at the University of Botswana's Department of Social Work in Southern Africa, and is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maryland in the Baltimore School of Social Work. She currently oversees the multidisciplinary team of mental health professionals who provide clinical services to the students at GW University. Dr. Berry presents nationally and internationally on effective clinical practice, stepped care approaches, and personal and professional development. On the far end, we have Dr. Tom Baez, who is a licensed psychologist and Director of Counseling at FURMAN University in Greenville, South Carolina. He has served in the past as Director of Counseling at the University of Texas in San Antonio and Adjunct Professor at the University of Texas Health Center in San Antonio. He's been an accreditation board member for the accrediting body for counseling centers. We won't hold this against Tom, but he did earn his PhD about 50 miles from here at Michigan State University. His master's at Ball State and his bachelor's at the University of Puerto Rico. He is a former staff member at New Mexico State University and is a former colleague of mine at the University of Michigan. So welcome back, Tom. And he's also presented nationally on the implementation of stepped care models and single session therapy in both large and small counseling centers. So one thing we've tried to be mindful of, because we look at who all attends these conferences over the last 16 years, literally, and we know there's a mix of big universities, mid-sized universities and colleges, and then smaller colleges. And so we've tried to reflect a little something for everybody, and so this panel was intentionally made up in this way. So please join me in welcoming and thanking the panelists for our program this morning. And we will get going. Think of questions. Note cards will be coming around. Write your question on the note card, and then we're going to save ample time at the end to address those questions. So,
great. Thank you, Todd. So I think I'll just start unless there's something you wanted to say before we start. So this is going to be conversational, and so often the questions that like the one I just asked, they didn't know I was going to ask it, so we're really trying to make this be real, and we didn't rehearse any of this. Did you want to say anything, or should I just get going?
No,
just get going? All right, thank you. So a little bit of, actually, let me back up here. A little bit of context, and as Todd was saying, what we're talking about today are college campuses, but I can tell you that there's, as I alluded to earlier, and I think Todd in the introduction, in Canada, we're doing this in many different sectors across the province of Newfoundland, in hospital and clinic settings, in downtown clinics for folks that are a whole spectrum, socioeconomic status, large communities, rural communities. There's work that we're doing exclusively on a whole population perspective, driven by the equivalent of NAMI, is it? National, what's that stand for?
National Association of Mental Health.
Mental Illness, which is consumer-driven sort of advocacy groups. So this has large appeal, and you'll see in there York Regional Police, which is one of the largest police departments in Canada, just part of Toronto, northern part of Toronto, and so they come from a first responder perspective, and they like stepped care, but for very different reasons than in the campus setting. We won't get into that now, but I just wanted to give you that perspective, and if you're interested, you could dive down into this sort of database and look at it. So back to the group here today, and I'll just, maybe, Tom, you could start by saying a little bit about the context which you've come from as it relates to, I guess, student needs and that sort of thing.
Yes, I do want to present that part of what I will be talking about is both my role as a director at University of Texas San Antonio, which is a public university of 30,000 students, where there's a combination of residential and non-residential, and then my most recent work at FURMAN University, which is a smaller campus of 2,700 students. It's private, so it's a very different range of working into different, from going through from publics to private, so most of my talk will speak about that. Most recently at FURMAN, we presented with this step care model about a year ago, and there was a lot of work in getting sort of people aware of it and buy into the model. We see 20% of our students, which is pretty not uncommon for privates, but it's quite a bit of students that we see. And so we needed to find a way to provide the service, be accessible, and as a result came this model.
That's probably higher, Tom, though, for smaller schools, the higher
It's
percentage.
amongst the highest, yeah.
And why is that you think?
Well, I think that there's more referrals from the community,
Okay.
and also expectations from parents that they seek services. There's a higher sense of visibility when a student is having struggles from the community and tend to refer them.
Versus a larger place, there's more anonymity, and maybe people fall through the cracks, or they have multiple communities.
Right. Okay. In the larger communities, like in the UTSA, which is a public university, you have more people that live in the community rather than on campus.
Okay.
And they may get services from the community other than the campus.
Okay. So Jillian, the GW context.
Where do I begin? So many of our students come to the DC area for obvious reasons. They are committed, they are proactive, they are really intrigued by being able to do an internship at the Senate or the Congress or even the White House. So a lot of students are really engaged on our community. So the idea of coming to the counseling center for many students is a sign of weakness, a sign of things aren't going well and they have to be ashamed of it. For example, there was one particular student who he got as further as the waiting room because he didn't want anything to do with us. He wanted the help, and we were creative enough to say I was going to speak to him on the phone because he didn't want to come in. The goal is, I think, on our campus is to make sure that we can actually meet those needs, as most of you, needs of the students in an environment that is conducive for them to be heard.
Good. Okay, thank you. And then the Memorial University context, which is sort of where the concept of 2.0 arose, is in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which before 1949 was an independent country colony of Great Britain, and they really wanted to join the United States because there's a long relationship with the U.S. in terms of military bases, in particular air bases, and so there was a really strong relationship with Americans, but unfortunately you wouldn't take them. So they grudgingly joined Canada. They had a referendum that was about 50-50 and all kinds of conspiracy theories about whether they were forced to join Canada. So there's an interesting cultural context there where if you're not born 3 generations in Newfoundland and Labrador, you are a CFA. And some of you may have seen Come From Away, the Broadway play, which when 9/11 happened, many U.S. planes landed in Gander and in St. John's, and so Newfoundlanders were delighted to host Americans because of that long-standing preference for Americans over Canadians. So I am a CFA that's not liked. Whereas when you were a Come From Away that was a guest, they loved you, but they don't really like the Canadians. So that's part of the context. It's a public institution in Canada. Our public institutions are probably cheaper in terms of tuition. They're more subsidized. In Newfoundland, heavily subsidized. So the tuition is only $2,000 or $2,500 per year, and anybody can come in Canada for that tuition. And that's part of our immigration strategy. We want more people to come to Newfoundland. But it's resourcing is tough, so budgets are really tight. And that's how Stepped Care came about initially, as a way to do more with less. But what we accidentally discovered is you actually can do more with this. And so I've shifted from this is a way, necessity is a mother of invention, to I think this is a best practice that that is more efficient and in fact is worth investing more in than you're currently investing in your services wherever you are. Oops, that's going the wrong way now. Sorry, I got lost here. Okay. So these are different graphic representations and of our particular models. And this can sometimes be a tension when you start to do design. You can either alienate people by, sort of so dramatically different, or it can help drive the change. And I was just wondering if, Tom, you could say a little bit about your particular model that's up at the top and what the role of that was and how you came up with that.
Yes. First, I wanted to, the staff was ready for some kind of change, really back-to-back sessions, feeling overwhelmed. And so I came with an idea of what could we do and what do we have already. And so at FURMAN, there were no groups going on, so that was a big change to add groups. There was requests for groups, but the model did not have that. It was just one-to-one single therapy. It wasn't a 12 sessions, so people were there for quite a while. So the change was to bring in, for example, what might be some groups that are needed and more for structured groups. Whereas at UTSA, we already had some groups, They're mainly more process-oriented, so we brought in more structured groups that met the needs of the students. And then the challenge, of course, for many of the models is to move from the default of single session to look at groups as an option, to look at other options like a single session therapy. When we looked at the numbers, oftentimes students just came once anyway. So the idea is how do we train staff? So we had to bring some training for staff to really recognize if you only have 1 hour, what would you do? And that was the model of the single session therapy. But at the end, also, we wanted to look at, from the topper part, the community referrals. And oftentimes, we struggle to refer students in the community because they may not get there or they may not have the funds for it. So we had to really strengthen that part to build, so we have a case manager that really focuses on community referrals and making sure that they get there, making sure that there's follow through, making sure that it's working for them, so that the staff feels comfortable in making those decisions to refer out rather than just keeping them in. So those are some elements of what we went through. Also, the addition of electronic resources. We use WellTrack, and that worked really well at UTSA, and that provided a different way or for others that are not coming to campus, that may be working and going to school, have another option 24/7 as electronic self-help methods. And that was cost effective for us at the UTSA, and it was also cost effective at FURMAN, to the point at FURMAN, we also purchased it for the staff and faculty. So the idea was that to the degree that staff and faculty felt comfortable with the tool, they would advise their students to use it. And that really has helped a lot.
So sometimes what I hear from small schools, and maybe just a question for the audience, are there any folks in the audience from universities or colleges, say, of 3,000 students or less? Okay, and you're about
2,700.
Okay, and some schools identify, when I see them at the AUCCD conference, they're a one-person shop, and they say, well, how do you do this with a one-person shop? So you must have enough people, a critical mass, that you can do groups.
Yeah,
correct?
you do need to have an adequacy of staff.
Yeah.
You just can't jump into this if you're just one staff member.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you can't do it all.
Yeah.
But so you might have to figure out what do you have and what can we add. So electronic resources are really, really helpful at that level if you're just one staff.
And so when we do, when I talk with folks about implementation, I might start with a model that looks like this and say, well, what do you already have that you can actually organize in here? So, and then where are the gaps? And then if there's too many gaps, you have to do a new picture, a new version of this. On that note, is there anything more you want to say about that graphic before I move on to Jillian?
I think we also have psychiatry, which is an important element. It's not full-time, it's part-time. But there are many areas in the country where that's an issue, where you can't access psychiatry. So having a psychiatrist with us really facilitates that coordination and treatment and accelerates treatment. So if we have it, we want to utilize it earlier on rather than later when students are much more in level of distress, and it's harder to really begin to use medication to help them maintain their functioning.
So Jillian, this slide is animated. Maybe you could just tell me why maybe there's two here.
Yes, we started off with that first slide. But a little bit of context. We call it the old model, which is the traditional model. We offered our students 6 free sessions and 6 paid sessions per academic year. Now, Peter talked about his university being very low cost. At GW, the fee last year, I think, is about $70,000, and that's without room and board. So it's very expensive. And so there's a lot of students who are coming in, who used to come into the counseling center, who would say, I paid for this, I want my sessions. Now, even though they didn't have anything to talk about, they'll be like, I want it because I paid for it. So
What do you do with that student when you sit down and meet with them?
we would talk about whatever they wanted to talk about, which was normally just a conversation that they would have with their friends.
So do you do the same thing I do? I don't. If they say that I want my 20 sessions or whatever, I say, well, let's talk about that.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
I don't say yes, I don't say no.
But we've shifted now because of the step care model. But when we started, let's say for one example, a student would ring up and say, I want to see a counselor. I'm highly stressed. I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety. The case manager would put that particular student on a counselor's schedule. It happened to be me. She came in to see me, and I said, okay, let's talk about what's causing you stress. She was booked for 6 sessions, same time, for 6 weeks. She talked about how she didn't know how to make a decision. She was packing up to go home for a break, and her luggage, her stuff that she wanted to ship cost too much money, and her mother was really angry, and she didn't know what to do. So we did a pros and cons list, and as a result of that session, she says, okay, I'm going to store it in the basement at my residence. And that was it. She was fine.
She didn't have to do therapy?
No, but she was booked on my schedule for 6 sessions. So that isn't a good use of our resources. And that led to us beginning to say to ourselves, what can we do different? It wasn't something that we could hire out, keep hiring more and more staff. We did run out of rooms. We were really struggling to say who's going to go where. But we had to face the reality that we couldn't keep going in the same way. We had to change the system. And the former director went to the directors' conference and saw Peter do a presentation for 10 minutes on a panel. And as a result, when we were just looking and exploring how we could change the system, we began to think about it from a practical perspective. I think our biggest thing was our wait list as well. That was unacceptable. It was in 3 digits, and it was causing too much stress on campus that students were going to have to wait so long to be seen by a counselor.
And so you started with this one graphic that's really is quite similar to what two of us
Yes.
had. And then you moved to, can you say a little bit about how that happened?
I think obviously we started off with your model, and we were thinking, okay, it has to look like steps.
Yeah.
But the more we began to practice, we wanted to really emphasize that at each stage, we could refer students to what we believe was the most appropriate way for them in terms of next steps.
So this is more like a buffet.
Yes.
You don't kind of have the principles embedded in
Yes.
this around intensity.
Yes.
And it's been a debate amongst people that I work with whether there's value front-facing of having principles, or whether the buffet is less complicated and doesn't have that hierarchy. Have you used your graphic at all with students, or is that just something that's just in the back theoretically?
No, that we've used it with students to help them get the big picture of what we have and what are the options, and we look at the options with them.
Okay. And so you didn't feel that was a tension around, because some people say, oh, hierarchy makes one sound better than the other or worse than the other.
We didn't have that. It was, I think the biggest issue was students thinking that the default was single session, or not single, I'm sorry, individual counseling.
And this helps them
to look at other options.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Groups, for example, in the FURMAN community was a little harder because everybody knows everybody. 2,700 students. They were afraid of meeting somebody that they already knew or knowing what was going on with them. And then so we dealt with that by talking about it. And so some students felt like maybe they wouldn't be there, but others didn't mind. So, I mean, they're not large size groups, they're 4 to 6. So some people felt uncomfortable, so they would still go back to their therapist. But others felt comfortable with it. So you get a variety of students, how they're feeling about the anonymity aspect of that.
You know, I'm going to do something you probably wouldn't expect right now. Don't get nervous. No need to. But on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, we have part of our free webinar series on stepped care. The focus is on groups, and I don't know if you're available, but
Yeah, I did schedule my time to do
okay,
that.
because I might do what I'm doing with these two right now, which is what I do in the webinars. A bit of an interview. We have some folks from the University of Victoria, and now I can't remember the other university that we have from the U.S. that I'm going to be doing a bit of this with in terms of how groups build groups. So having your perspective from a small place with those comments would be useful. And all of you would be welcome to join that. You can find that on the website if you happen to be available. It's a free webinar. Okay, so let's move on to some other aspects of the implementation. So I don't know if any of you have heard this before. It's culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch or whatever. And Jillian, what does that mean to you? Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
We actually have to not be afraid to really look at what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it.
And so strategy, if strategy doesn't, when I think about it, strategy doesn't have inspiration and it doesn't meet with the audience, it doesn't inspire you. And part of what, if we weren't so far away from you, we'd have a better sense of, is this kind of connecting with you? Is this inspiring you, or is this have no relevance to you? And when we're implementing with our staff, we can have a great idea, a great concept, or I think it's great and I'm enthusiastic about it. But if we're not connecting with the culture or the climate, either the community or the people that have to implement, then that culture, your strategy could be the best strategy ever. So we're really talking about leadership on change. And there's a science behind that, of course there is, but the science itself is the strategy. It's the how you do it, of course, good leadership. And so sometimes leadership is, people have natural abilities. And I think both Tom and Jillian have that. And they didn't, Tom drew a little bit on implementation science. You read some of those things on change management.
Right.
And Jillian is just Jillian. and Jillian did it, right? And it's kind of like therapists, I mean, you can have some gifted therapists that do wonderful work, and all the manualized treatments aren't that important. But if, I think the best approach is to, if you can, draw on the implementation with so you don't have to just depend on your personality. So what is implementation science? And this definition is a pretty dry scientific study of methods to promote systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, and hence to improve outcomes, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of boring. I like the little formula. So this kind of gets to this evidence-based treatment. We need things that are, we know that, well, these probably work, like ICBD works, CBT works, but if you don't implement it right, or if you have a web-based program, it can be the best web-based program in the world, but if you don't figure out how to engage the culture with this new approach, students aren't going to try it, or they're going to try it and they're going to bounce out. So for example, an online program, what we found at Memorial, more and more, we need to spend time engaging in the online with them, the human in there. And so often what we'll do is we'll go onto the web right together, side by side, and go into these web-based programs so the relationship's maintained. Because technology can be a big barrier. One little glitch or one clunky kind of link, and forget it, people are impatient. And then the enabling contexts. I don't, on the spot, I'm not really sure what the enabling contexts are specifically. Any guesses for you what that would be on your campuses? What are the enabling contexts for change? Tapping into what's top of mind, or tapping into the administration's frustrations, or what are they So what was the context at GW before?
I can talk about the majority of staff at the counseling center were staff psychologists, and they were very committed to their craft. So the idea of not offering therapy was really personally upsetting for them, and a lot of the students, as I mentioned before, were very clear that they wanted the best, and they wanted that staff psychologist, that most qualified person, to present in their minds.
So that was a roadblock.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So then what were the things that made this attractive? Like what was the context that said, we got to do this?
Our 3-digit wait line.
Okay.
Wait list. I think we were very clear that we wanted quality. We wanted to make sure that we were meeting the students' needs, and the idea of students who were coming in to see us and they were being put on a wait list 10, 14 days, that was unacceptable.
So everybody on your campus saw that as a shared, or agreed that that was a problem.
Yeah.
That everyone was motivated to fix.
Yes,
The wait list.
yes.
Okay.
Student newspaper covered that in detail.
I think for us was also similar. At UTSA, we had 4 weeks to get in. After the step care, it was 0. I checked last week, they're still at 0. But as a director, when it gets around Thanksgiving and you're feeling like really tight, are we going to make it? And you're able to surpass Thanksgiving, then you say we're good. At FURMAN, it was the whole system feeling that they can't get the students in. The feeling, oh, I can't get my student in, was a really strong piece that we used to say, well, let's do something different.
So your staff were kind of demoralized or feeling guilty, or
They were just feeling like, you look at the schedule and they're all full.
Yeah.
There's no openings anywhere, and you feel like, well, what can we do differently?
Okay.
And that kind of really opened it up for staff to be open to, let's consider something different.
Okay. Okay. So there's a bit more data on here in some of the other places where we've implemented. In Ontario, Canada's biggest province in terms of population, they're implementing in what are called wellness youth hubs. So this YWHO down here is Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, and they are connected with one of our premier institutions on mental health that gets lots and lots of grant and federal and provincial funding. I don't know what the equivalent would be. Sort of like NIMH in Canada, CAMH is what it's called. And so they have lots of implementation science going on there. They're really using the evidence to drive. Unfortunately, they don't have Jillians there, so we might have to bring you up to Canada to help them out. So a little bit more about the kind of strategy, starting with Tom. So in your title of this slide, big, small, private, public, are these sort of just general kinds of requirements that you've sort of
common things that I found in both universities with the sense of needing to create a vision of what we were doing, both at the counselor's level, and communicate that with the higher level administration about what our vision was. And so administrative support was key to that. We had to sell it to them as well, for them to buy into the idea of we've got to change something at counseling. And that came as a result of that. There was a need for funding. And sometimes you don't have a lot of funding, so you've got to piece it with other universities. So we gathered with other universities to bring in the training that was needing, splitting the cost for the trainers. So there are different ways that we put it together in order to have the training available. And the key was also needing a champion within the staff, other than the director, to say, let's try this, or yeah, I think this is going to work, and that inspired others. So having that champion was really key to that.
That's okay. These are just some questions that are coming in.
Okay.
I'm inviting you to think about that one when we get a chance.
Yeah.
So we're gonna, as we're continuing our conversation, we're gonna think about ways to weave in some of the questions that.
Do you want me to respond to this?
Yeah, sure. Well,
Yeah.
let's go. So this one's about paperwork. Yeah, so what sort of paper? Single
So-
session paper? Is it single session paperwork? Is that the question, or?
No, it's in the initial consultation.
Initial consult,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So we have electronic Titanium, that's our electronic record system, that has a web component, and the students will fill that out on the pad, the notepad, and they just take 5 minutes. Including in there is an evaluation called the CCAPS, which actually, as Todd would say, it started here at Michigan, with initial CCAPS, having a tool to assess students that were not sort of clinical model of students. And that's where it all started, and that just took off and has really been validated. And, so we've kept using that as a way to assess what do we have, what is a student going through as part of the initial evaluation.
Okay. And so there's some interesting different ways to do paperwork. As you move to stepped care, there's less, you tend to collect less data on deficits, so that sort of cuts down. You tend to do case development only if sort of what was the example that the student that came in wanted help with what, that you talked to?
The parcel, how she was going
How
to
was going to ship a parcel. So, you didn't get a family history, did you?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, and so guess what? The case note's not so complicated. And so we're not turning over these stones. And then that allows you to have a sort of higher volume without this burden of paperwork. But it does require a challenging shift, because most of it, when we see students coming through, they were taught, you have to do this on a first session. You have to ask a zillion questions. And we debated about whether we would show this video today. If you Google it, it's one word, modern counseling, and it's an animated sort of
A cartoon
satire of the numbers of questions we ask, and we actually don't help. And if we have time later, if we think it might fit, we could show it. But it's attention, often in implementation, because people think about, the questions I have is, well, my licensing body says that's not enough for me to write it down. So what I say to them is, where does it say that in your licensing procedures? And then when they go and check, it's pretty vague, most of them, about what you have to write down. And then the second question is, well, how am I going to remember enough to treat? Well, with this model, we share that responsibility of what we're going to talk about. It's not our job necessarily to know what we're going to talk about. If you're doing one session at a time, each encounter is a new one that doesn't require you to connect the history. Now you could, and you probably will remember the important things, but that's often a very difficult thing for people that are first learning to practice and first being trained. So with implementation, you have to be really sensitive to that and allow that to sort of that development, lots of support and training to move this way. You don't do it all at once. Now, of course, some people do. Jillian kind of did it all at once.
Yes, and I can talk about that shortly. I think, starting with the implementation, I think we started with the recognition that positivity is infectious. The idea that we can be positive about the work that we do for the staff, to really begin to enjoy that process of seeing students really begin to have insight into what's going on for them. And when we begin to focus on the quality of what we were offering, we realized that for some students, that's not what they came to us for. Now, one of the questions that I've got here, it says, can you share some concrete strategies for responding to students who are not satisfied with the steps for their needs, if their needs don't fall into it? I think I said that correctly. The goal is the step care model, the step care approach, and the graphics that we have here For me, that guides what we do as therapists. We want the students, when they come to see us, to not feel as if they are fitting into some model as such, but we are going to focus on what is right for them. Now, that means that we're going to listen to what they have to say and prioritize what their needs are. And based on our clinical sort of understanding of what they're presenting, together with the student, begin to come up with a plan of what's appropriate for them.
I have a story that might illustrate that. So it's based on a real case at the University of British Columbia, but I came to be aware of it when I was doing a full-day workshop for their counselors in Vancouver. When I often say, I'll do a demonstration of a first visit, and bring your most challenging case. What was the question? When responding to students who are not satisfied with the steps. So this was what this counselor brought in, a real doozy, and role-played it wonderfully. So the protocol for us at Memorial is in the waiting room, it's not the CCAPS, it's the BHM 20, but they also see our graphic. They don't see our graphic in the waiting room, but they see a description of this graphic and stepped care. And this person came in, or the role play, and before I even could start, said, I read that stuff in the waiting room, and I don't want any of that step care shit. Okay, so, okay. I said, okay, that's fine. But I just want to tell you a little bit more about what you read in the waiting room. Yeah, but don't give me that Tao stuff, that online. Because when I went, so I couldn't get a word in, right? So when I went all through high school, I was very suicidal and very depressed, and I had therapy every week. And the first thing going through my mind is, well, off you go. Did your parents pay for that? But I didn't say that. And that's what I need right now to keep me alive. And I said, okay, well, I really want to keep you alive. I think that's really important. Tell me a little bit more about what happened in that therapy for you. Well, it was so important to me. I knew I had a place to come in every week. I could kind of get things off my chest, and it just kept me from sinking. It just kept me from going over the edge. And again, I said, I'm glad that you had that, and we really want to make sure that you have something that keeps you going over the edge. And then a little bit of suspicion came up. That something can't be anything except what I had before. That was the sort of the message. And I said, I asked a question about, okay, so then, what happened to your depression and your sort of crisis level over time in the therapy? Well, it just sort of kept me going. And so really the answer was, well, nothing. Nothing changed. It just kept me alive. And I said, well, I agree that's really important. But something, I'm kind of two minds, because I want more for you than that. I want more for you than keeping you alive. And I think something in addition to that therapy might be, or the therapy that you had, I'd like to stretch. I'd like for it to be more powerful so that you're feeling better. And so the role-playing person started to scratch their head. There was a little bit of intrigue, and then said, "Well, what do you mean? What would that look like? Because I don't want to try that other stuff." And I say, "Yes, I know you don't want to try that." Well, what it would be is, I think I would challenge you, because I want more for you. I'd give you a comfortable space, but I'd work hard. And so I'm willing to work with you weekly like you did, but it's going to be hard work. And then so there was a bit of, what do you mean? What do you mean hard work? Well, it's kind of like what I'm doing right now. I've just challenged you, and that's what it would be. And I try and do it in a way that's sensitive. And I saw the student sort of doing this, and I said, but there's other options in stepped care. Oh, no, don't go there, right? And I said, but hang on, just give me a minute. We have trainees, and our trainees they're very eager to challenge people. They want to try all the fancy techniques they've learned, and we tell our trainees, you're not allowed to do that. You're just allowed to be supportive, listening, and make it comfortable. So that might be a little bit like what you had before, is that you will get support, you'll have empathy, because that's what these folks in our center do. So that's an option for you. And in the role play, that's what the person decided to do. So it tied into the readiness, but it also, there was a little seed planted that if you want weekly psychotherapy with an experienced therapist, that's fine, but you got to be ready to work. And I think that's something that you do
Absolutely.
as well, Delia.
When I arrived on campus, the feedback in the community was, what is it that the counseling center was doing? Because they perceived counseling as being, just talking to a friend. What was the difference? And that concerned me a great deal. But the students now, 2 years to 3 years into the step care, are really noticing a difference. And the culture's now shifted with the first year students and the sophomore students to seeing counseling as being hard work, as being the place where they're going to be kind of stretched to begin to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it so that they can actually make the changes that they want in their lives.
I thought I want to go to a video from Jillian's staff in a moment, and that really focuses on implementation. But I thought there's a couple of questions that I'd like to kind of introduce and have you think about, and maybe respond to now. Maybe we could follow up a little bit later on this. But it's around culture. So one question is, our campus is extremely international, and it's extremely is underlined twice. So, but it's not in caps, so it's probably not. It's sort of and our campus is not extremely, but probably 15% international. What's your sense, both of you having spent a large portion of your life in different cultural contexts, about how the model fits or doesn't?
Well, I guess I would say we've had really good success, particularly looking at working with Asian students, international students at our campus. And I think it was that, our center seemed very inviting and comfortable for them to come and not fitting into the default of the single session. So I think part of that's been the staff and being able to be perceived as inviting and welcoming to international students. And some students, going back to the initial question, feel most comfortable just dropping in some cultural. And that might be more fitting culturally to just drop in. Without needing to be seen, and when you think about stigma, fitting into this counseling role or as a client. So some are just more comfortable just walking in or seeing a counselor for once or twice sessions. Rather than,
I actually have to agree with that. The idea for many students is that I want to deal with it immediately. I don't want to put this off. And so the idea of having to come back 3 or 4 times to get through the assessment to actually do the work can be off-putting for students of color.
This gets a little abstract, but synergy is a concept that's known to ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, where community is the main principle, and community is made up of lots of little pieces that on their own are not very powerful. And so the previous slide showed the concept of a geodesic dome, where you have these little fragile pieces of metal, but together they produce something that's really powerful. And I think what we find from cultures other than white ones and white European industrialized is that somehow that's implicit, that you need to have all these pieces into a structure that makes sense, because the structure, the community, all your partners, whether it be peers, whether in Canada right now, there's a huge push for what's called indigenization of our campuses, because recognizing the First Peoples of Canada as for having treaty rights and having being very much marginalized, but the value of that is it brings in principle of community, and so how is that reflected concretely? This idea of showing up when I want something, I think is correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little bit more what people expect in other cultures. And in our culture, Western industrialized, I don't know if any of you have ever lived in France, but to get a bank account, there's 54 procedures you have to go through to get the bank account. So bureaucracy is a real, I'm not saying there aren't bureaucracies and ridiculous bureaucracies in other cultures, but the idea of going and getting help, you find out who's the local person, and you go, you sit on their doorstep, and you wait. And so in some ways I think it really fits the idea that no one size fits all, the idea that it's not prescriptive, like we don't, like, you need CBT. No, it's like, okay, who are you? What are your solutions? Solution-focused methods are all about, well, what have you tried before? What works? What are your previous successes? Before we introduce some colonial version of what is best practice. Anything more on that, Jillian?
Well, I've got a question here. How do you support students of color whom want to meet with a person of color therapist when the community options are scarce? For me, the idea of having or using technology can really benefit there in terms of being able to use some of the e-mental health resources to connect with somebody of color online. The other most important thing is, if it's not available, it's about just exploring what is that person saying when they want to connect to somebody of color. Do they want to feel that sense of being comfortable, being understood, and is that something that the institution needs to do more of in order to help that? I think predominantly white institutions, which GW is one, wants to have that conversation, wants to be able to make sure students who are coming to GW get the experience that they're looking for. But it does involve more than that. So, for example, with us, we have Let's Talk, which is specifically for the students of color. We have walk-ins where there's a person of color available to meet that student. But my goal is that if the student of color is aware of what it is that they're actually looking for, designing a program that they can actually be heard. And I think that some of the counselors can do that. They can really begin to work with that. So we have in our counseling center, we have diversity in the workshop, where we as a team are very conscientious in making sure that we are addressing those issues ourselves, so that a student of color can begin to be hopefully heard by the person that they're working with. One of my white colleagues is working on a white supremacist workshop in order to raise her awareness. And so those kind of things hopefully can begin to create an environment where we aim to meet the needs of any student who comes before us.
So that's a clinic, sort of still considered a clinic-based activity. But I had a question that related to culture as well, but where do families fit in? Because we know for recovery that family is really important. In the previous slide that I had up here with this one, so it didn't have families in there. It probably would. So thank you for that question, because I'm going to put families in this yellow box. So what we do is we consider things that can be done by professionals in the clinic setting, but we also bring in partners to look at this graphic and see, well, they're very interested in being part, in coming into the tent, so to speak. And we love that too, because then those are other referral points for us, and the referral points that we then have a relationship with, so we can build trust and stay connected with some of these local organizations. And Tom, you were going to say
I was
something.
going to go back to that question about the African American. I think our counseling centers need to be diverse. And so leadership needs to make that effort to diversify to the best of our ability to have that diversity. We just recently hired an African American therapist, and that made a world of difference. Even though our staff was multicultural trained and were perceived well by different diverse groups, it really made a difference for our students of color, Black students, to feel that they were represented. And we've had students that just walk in to meet with the therapist, the counselor. They just wanted to meet her. And there's others that really want to be seen by an African American therapist. But not all are that way. Not all students that are Black want to see a Black therapist. But the importance of the counseling center being open to diversifying the staff is really important, and it says a lot about our centers.
And so what I would add to that, if you don't have the ability to do that, or you can't reflect all the diversity, University of Victoria, who will be on this webinar on Tuesday, and somebody asked how can you access the webinar, and probably the best thing is you can find it on the Stepped Care 2.0 website under resources link. So the website is steppedcare2 spelt out, point spelt out, 0.ca. You'll find information about that. But on Tuesday, one of the groups that from University of Victoria, they've developed a lot of their group programming through partners in their Indigenous and chaplaincy network, and so they're very closely affiliated with something that isn't clinic based, and there's a lot of work that needs to go into that partnership and developing that relationship. But one of the principles of stepped care is that you don't have to do it all, the value of that is it gets out of this medicalization of ordinary life when we bring in partners to be doing some of this care. And if you're worried about, well, what are the risks in recommending something that you don't have control over? You share that risk with the student. You say, it's not something that we know for sure will work for you, because if you've set up fail forward all the way along, you teach them how to decide whether this is for them. And recovery principles assume that people have more capacity and integrity and ability. Now, not all people. Some people are really, really ill. They can't make informed choices for themselves about what works for them. But most people can if you prepare them. And then if you've got monitoring built in, so every time they come and see you, you're monitoring. So if they've gone out to this kind of community group, whether it's called Knit and Talk or some of the organizations, you're helping them to discern whether that's working for them. You're empowering them because you're not just being paternalistic. I know what's best for you.
And that leads on to this particular question. What potential do you see for step care models to expand and include lower tier resources outside of the counseling center? And I think that just goes to answering your question. I think the creativity of this particular model can be applied outside. My previous experience in England has been in the child welfare system, and we had a version of the step care model where the goal was to use resources. We had social aunts and social uncles in order to offer support in a very non-traditional way.
So this slide is bringing up some things that are outside in our Canadian context. 7 Cups you would see here too, and a lot of my colleagues go, 7 Cups, that's really dangerous. I encourage you to Google Tom Insel, who he's INSEL. He's the former director of the NIMH for 15 years, National Institute of Mental Health, joined Google, now has his own company that's really trying to change the way, kind of like what we're talking about, change the way we do mental health. And he's also the chair of the board of 7 Cups. And finally, he's known as Dr. iPhone. And so he, in his talk, if you Google him, you'll see that he says that your iPhone or your Android phone knows more can predict whether you are depressed or anxious better than any expert clinician, because it knows how you're moving, it knows how you're sleeping, it knows who you're talking to or how much you're talking, and we have not harnessed this technology. But the 7 cups thing is amazing, and he talks about that, because what it's telling us is that we don't like it necessarily as professionals. Sometimes it feels threatening that this other thing might erode our profession. And we also worry about, well, what if they get a listener? So this is a text-based active listening peer support program. There's 300,000 of them worldwide. It's sort of like the Uber of mental health. And so people say, well, I have some clinicians that when I'm in a workshop, they go in and they log on and then they pretend to be somebody seeking help. And they go, oh my God, that was a creepy person that I connected with. I said, yeah, that can happen. How easy would it be for you to just click and say that was bad and go to another one? They go, oh no, but I can't get my clients to do that because that would just trigger them. I said, well, not if you prepare them. Not everyone you would refer to, but what are trigger warnings about? They're not about avoiding taking risks. So if you prepare people, so the point that Tom makes is we can think all we want about what people need and the best practices and the evidence-based treatments, but if you have 300,000 people that they never predicted are starting to use this platform, we better figure out why they're doing it, and we better help them if they need it, to decide whether that's useful for them. The other thing that's on this graph is this, what's called MUN Minds, Memorial University Newfoundland. So this was an advocacy group that formed because they didn't like what we were doing. And so they were a lobby group for the university to change the way we're doing mental health. And so I said, great, bring them onto my team and they can help us design. They're our best friends now, and they started peer groups. They wanted their separate peer groups, but there was real value in collaborating with them. They set up a peer center because their theory was that a lot of people are too intimidated to go to counseling. Nobody showed up at their peer center. Nobody. No one would ever come. They were scratching it. Why doesn't anybody want to come? So then it led to a discussion of why that might be. Maybe they don't trust. Maybe they want more specialized. And I said, why don't you join our framework? We can give you some legitimacy, but you can still be separate and be this lower tier. Even better, we said, there's a 7 cups thing. Why don't you guys investigate it and see if you can make it fly on this campus? So that's where sort of the implementation science came in, is that you had the community take this on, and the students take this on as a project, which endorsed this peer concept. So we're one of the campuses that have had it best implemented, I think anywhere in North America, because I connected it with the consumer needs. Okay, so I do want to show, we've got some more questions, and I do want to show this video. Should we still do it? Yeah, okay.
This is a brief video about my staff at the Counseling Centre and their experiences of before, during, and after implementing the step care.
When I started Step Care was brand new. We'd traditionally been running a wait list of about 250 students this semester, and waits were anywhere from about 10 to 15 business days between when a student came in and when they were assigned to a clinician.
I arrived here the semester before the launch of the stepped care model. And so when I started here, I really learned the model in what we call the old way, which is that I would have times blocked out on my calendar where I would have somebody would assign me cases, and I would show up on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday and look at my calendar, and I'd have a name pop up in my calendar, and that would be my new person. And that person would also have automatically 6 appointments scheduled on my calendar.
So before, when I first started, it was not uncommon for us to be running a triple-digit wait list, for us to be receiving angry phone calls and really bad press in the newspaper for people waiting 6 to 8 weeks for appointments. It's very, very, very stressful. Our system beforehand was one where students would do an initial consult, and then we would just automatically send them to our case assignment team, and then our case assignment team would schedule them with the available clinicians as their schedules opened up. Just wasn't a sustainable model.
I was a little comforted by the fact that I could just rely on somebody else to give me those clients, and that I knew what I was doing, because that my calendar was done for me, and I didn't have to think about it. But I also felt a little bit limited in my options for working with students.
The big problem that we were running into is that we just had too much demand for what we could provide with the clinicians that we had, and so within 2 or 3 months of the fall semester starting, we were running wait lists that were up in almost around 100 students, and that just wasn't great for the students. It was taking many students several weeks to get in, and so students may have lost motivation for treatment during that time, or may have just had to kind of wait, and we weren't always able to keep track of how they were doing during that time period, which wasn't great for us from a clinical perspective or even from a legal perspective, to not know exactly what was going on with those students while they're on our wait list.
My understanding of why the step care has come into place is because of just the high volume of students coming in, and so we certainly saw that. And before step care, there could be a long wait to get people into mental health services, and we certainly saw that in psychiatry. When we would try to refer people over, we knew about halfway through the semester it would be hard to get people into regular therapy. So it's nice not to have a waiting list.
So in the beginning, I felt like the step care model was quite overwhelming, not really sure how it was going to work. But as I began using it, I really saw its usefulness, and that not every client really needs to be in our chairs 6, 8, 12 sessions. Sometimes they just need support for the moment. Sometimes they just need brief check-ins, and when they come in, they seem to be very satisfied with the idea of the flexibility, especially with the student schedule and how crazy their schedules can be.
The step care approach has been how I've been trained, and what I find with it is that it's sort of a touch point for me to keep going back to. There's a tendency to sort of say, oh, well, I could see you forever, but it is that sort of impetus that makes me say, hey, no, I actually have to think about what are the goals for this client, what does each person really need, and what's going to help them. And it really helped me, I think, in learning to do quick assessment, to really come in with that in mind with clients, because it forces you to think about, how am I meeting this individual's needs?
And I was trained in the traditional sense of counseling. So as a licensed professional counselor, we were sort of trained in the long-term therapeutic approach. So when I came to GW, I had some hesitation but excitement about the short-term step care model, because I felt like it was sort of asking me to write with my left hand when I was really right-handed. And so I wasn't sure what it would look like, and I didn't want clients to feel like they were abandoned halfway through what they were expecting out of care. But then with the training that Peter Cornish, so having Peter Cornish come and explain it in his own words was extremely helpful. And then I think having staff and supervisors who also admitted that they had struggled with the transition, but had how much it had actually helped them in their practice, really made it comfortable for me to go ahead and use this in my everyday practice.
And the working groups were made up of all of our senior staff clinicians to work on developing the other steps in the step care model. And that was probably the most difficult process of establishing the step care, because there were lots of people on staff who said they didn't have the training to do that. They didn't feel as though they knew how to create other steps, felt that their comfort in providing therapeutic services was in individual and interpersonal and relational ongoing individual sessions, and that it almost felt like it was undermining their expertise as therapists, to ask them to do things that felt like case management, things that didn't feel as meaningful to them as their individual sessions.
So it's been really useful in terms of just helping clients to know that they're well supported and resourced here, and also for those who need a little bit more, we give them that little bit more until we connect them with someone else. But the idea is that students haven't had to wait as long, and that's been a lot of relief for us as clinicians, and seemingly very relieving for the students too.
And now, after implementing step care, we're on our 4th consecutive semester of no wait list at all. So right now we're seeing, again, about 65 new walk-ins each week and about 400 appointments total with about 15 clinicians. But by being able to meet with each student and determine their individual needs, while they do still get an option for 6 hours of therapy, I would say that some of my students come in and really do feel supported in just 1 or 2 sessions. And so then that frees up my schedule to see other students who have greater need for a little bit longer.
But now, you know, when we see students, we really have a wide range of services that we can offer them, including some students really want to only meet every other week so they can extend their eligibility time. Some students really only have time for a half an hour session, or at least that's all they're willing to commit to. And we can do that now, whereas we didn't have the structure in place to do that before. So
I like the stepped care model that in the way that you can be really flexible and really creative with each individual client.
Stop? Okay.
As a lot of people are talking about the positives.
Anything else you wanted to sort of say, or about the we had another question about cultural. Wanted to hear more from Jillian. Not sure what. Do you have a sense? Is there anything more you wanted to say about culture?
Yes, because it goes through everything that we do, and I think my goal is hopefully to prepare the students appropriately to navigate the system that they find themselves in. And it's, for me, the step care resonates because it allows me to work in a way that I can be creative and flexible in helping them to meet their needs rather than to be confined by the quote-unquote old way that we used to do things, which was very restricted.
Okay. So talking a little bit about client experience, so we just heard about providers, and Tom, you've had some experience with walk-ins, this sort of single session at both the campuses?
Yeah, we certainly introduced single session therapy, and different universities have tried different things of how to introduce that. For example, UTSA initially had offered set schedules for walk-in for single session therapy. And then they've decided that they were going to try 1 day a week. And that's when they're doing the walk-in Wednesdays. So that means that no appointments are ongoing clients are seen, as everybody walks in. And so those are some things that in some ways, when you think about the step care, it's not a set model that you just do one way, but you continue experimenting to what's really going to help. So they were doing the once a week. Florida Gulf Coast University was also doing once a week. And so we're still experimenting with ways, how do we offer this? At FURMAN, what we're planning are doing is at the end of the semester, when you only have 1 week anyway to work with students, why not plan that and make it 2 weeks before the end of classes, walk-ins, and you can still address crisis interventions, but you really focus on, since some students you've worked with are preparing for finals, do they really need to come in? Why not open it up to anybody that could walk in and do a consultation, half an hour, and if you need to switch that to a crisis, then you switch it. And so that's kind of things that we're experimenting, making sure that we're really giving our staff and the ability to be creative with it, and not just do the one-to-one weekly 1 hour therapy, and it gives them a lot of energies to try something different.
And so just moving on a little bit with, I think there's you've got something from, no, sorry, that you've talked about UTSA, hang on. So the last thing that I want to talk about is a bit about the outcomes, and I know we're running out of time. Right. And so there's a lot of, on this PowerPoint, lots of data and lots of research, but I want to go down to the caseloads. Where's yours, Jillian? There. Okay, so tell me about August 31st, 2015.
We had a very hard introduction, which was from August 31st, the beginning of the new fall semester. In 2015, we were going to implement. So prior to that date, we had a lot of resistance from some staff who were feeling that they weren't prepared, they didn't want it to happen. So we set the date, and it happened. And it was difficult, but as you heard from the staff, once we began to work from this perspective, it really made our lives and that of the students that much better.
Okay. And so Jillian was part of a publication that's in Psychological Services, where we some of the implementation experiences are described in there, as well as early data. And some of the early data includes things like this, where you see changes in caseloads, and so increases in your caseloads because your capacity is increasing, and you're not spending as long with fewer people. And that some of the concerns that are raised initially in the transition is it takes more of a mental load, was what some of therapists felt. But as you reduce the burden of some of the other activities like paperwork and the expectations of how much responsibility they take for clients and sharing that responsibility, that became more manageable. Of course, attendance goes way up when you have walk-in, because there's no such thing as a missed session. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, because sometimes providers say, oh my God, that's so nice to have that empty space. And so you need to create room for what one of my colleagues in Nova Scotia calls passion programs for providers. So, the reinforcement for freeing up space is what's the passion project or program that's you're feeling passionate about that you could work on, as opposed to, you know what, we're just going to keep filling in your caseload.
There's a fear if you do walk-ins that you'll get flooded. It hasn't happened. In fact, does allow you more time to work with others that need more. And that's sort of how you balance that. Yeah. But we've not seen any floods of students.
What's your sense of outcomes? In terms of, do you have any kind of data on satisfaction, or just a sense of
Yes, we take satisfaction surveys at the end of every third session. But as a center-wide, we take it every semester, towards the end of the semester, and the satisfaction is high.
So what we found at Memorial before and after implementation is that satisfaction didn't change. It was high to begin with on a 5-point scale, and it remained high. There really was no statistical difference, didn't improve. But what you can see is you're reaching more students, and satisfaction stayed high. I think we're probably just out of time. There are roadblocks. We probably don't have time to go through this, but maybe I'll just ask both of you if you could identify what were some of maybe one key roadblock.
Very quickly, I think it's to trust our professionalism.
So the roadblock was...
Yes, I think people were so comfortable with the structure being set, 50-minute sessions. So the idea of shifting to 15 minutes or a 10-minute check-in seemed very scary for, I think, a lot of staff. But once they began to trust their clinical judgment more, they realized they can actually, meet that particular student needs based on the assessment that they did, to the satisfaction of the student. And it didn't necessarily have to look like what came before.
Well, I think in addition to the buy-in, you do really need to have adequate staffing for anything that you do. And so that's really an important element. You can't just run through adding all these elements and not have adequate staffing. It's just impossible. So, and that was really important. And then the training, figuring out what training do we need to add to our staff for them to feel comfortable adapting these methods. And single session therapy was one of them. The step care model was one of them. Peter's videos are really helpful. We showed them to staff to see how that was implemented, and that created buy-in. When we showed Jillian's video, we heard staff speaking as sort of this change talk, that they're already making that change conceptually about how they're doing it, or how are they making decisions about seeing students that only need to be seen for 30 minutes. And so when you see staff talking about it, they've made the change conceptually.
Okay. And the last thing that I wanted to just show you is just off the top of my head last night, I thought, what are some of the things that are really crucial for success that together we've found, and the other people that I've consulted with. But going back to the videos, do get a question, how do we access that? And how do you sign up for the webinars? And so if you're interested, maybe the easiest thing is just to come up here afterwards, if you have a few minutes, and I can just go to the website for you. But these principles, I don't know if you guys have anything to say about these, these boxes. I would say this is maybe the gold standard. If you think of implementation, there's a gold standard, and then there's the what would be acceptable, and then there'd be what would sort of not really make this work. So how many boxes here do you think you have? If you can see that. Same day access, you've got that checked?
We got that.
Both that, yeah. One at a time sessions,
Yeah.
you have concept, yeah. What about
Care first.
care first, assessment later? Yeah. The fail
Fail
forward,
forward, yes.
the sharing of responsibility, if it's not working, come back.
Yes.
How much do you think your counselors have that in their
They have
session?
it pretty,
Okay.
really well set.
Monitoring? Are you both doing therapeutic, like CCAPs or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're doing that
Are they using it at every session?
every
session.
fourth session for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got the graphic. And then implementation science maybe is something that most of us haven't thought about, but if you're beginning, draw on that, and maybe within your institutions there may be some experts on this that can help you to think, what do we know from the literature about implementing a change that, as Jillian's video shows, it can be challenging more for us than everybody else. So Todd, I don't think we have time for questions. We got a lot of them here, and am I correct? We just need to move on? I think
There was a question about training. Maybe I can go through that.
Okay.
Some of the trainings that we've held is obviously single session therapy. We've brought in Monty Bobel. There's another Hare that you...
Heather Hare and
Hare.
Karen Young in Canada. But Monty, we have him on video. So he attended our last Step Care webinar, and the video link to that is on the website. And both Heather and Monty were in a conversation.
Motivational interviewing was also really helpful to have for our staff. Those are some of the few.
So the panelists will stay up here for a few minutes. We have 15 minutes before the next block of program starts. And just a note that our lunch, which will include the student award winners, is in the Michigan League. And for those of you not familiar with our campus, it's just a few steps out this way. If you need directions, ask any of us. But please join me in thanking the panel for their work this morning.